Afghanistan's strategic location at the crossroads of South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East has long made it a coveted territory for many empires throughout history. But its mountainous terrain, hard climates, and fragmented tribal society has made it notoriously difficult to control. From Alexander the Great to the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States, many powerful forces through history have struggled to maintain control over the region, which has earned it the moniker the graveyard of empires. The United States is the latest power to fail in the area. Despite US efforts to establish a democratic government in the country for over 20 years, the Taliban waged a constant insurgency, culminating in the embarrassing US retreat of August 2021. I'm sure we all remember crazy scenes from the US departure. The great US Army confined to an airport and people holding onto airplanes as a hope to escape. Crazy stuff. Today, the Taliban rule Afghanistan unopposed, enforcing a strict version of Islamic law on the populace. So what is life like now under the Taliban? How does the government function under this Islamic state? And what does the future hold? This is how countries work. Let's find out. So, despite the region's long history of conflict, Afghanistan spent most of the 20th century in relative peace under King Mohammad Zahir Shah. However, a coup d'etat in 1973 led to the end of its centuries-old monarchy. Since then, Afghanistan's history has been dominated by extensive warfare, including coups, invasions, insurgencies, and civil wars. This initial instability led to the eventual establishment of a communist government in 1978, imposing Marxist rule through Afghanistan, but also led to widespread violence throughout the country. The Soviet Union invaded in 1979 in order to support the Afghan communists. Despite initial successes, the Soviets eventually found themselves bogged down in a prolonged and costly conflict against Afghan rebels, contributing to significant suffering in Afghanistan and playing a major role in the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. After the Soviets' withdrawal in 1989 and the eventual collapse of the communist government, the individual rebel groups turned on each other and the country descended into a chaotic civil war, with individual warlords taking control of different areas of the country. In 1994, the Taliban rose to power in their heartland of Kandahar, and by 1996, had already gained control of the capital Kabul and control much of the country, establishing an Islamic Emirate, enforcing strict Islamic laws and customs. The Taliban's regime was toppled by US-led forces in 2001 as part of the US war on terror after the September 11 attack on the Twin Towers, and due to their support for Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. The United States helped establish a new Afghan government, a presidential republic, with continued support from US-led NATO forces to combat Taliban insurgencies. Again, despite initial success with the overthrow of the Taliban, the US found itself bogged down in a prolonged and costly conflict against Taliban rebels. US involvement in the area steadily dwindled, which would eventually lead to the complete collapse of the Afghan government in August 2021, causing the US retreat and allowing the Taliban to once again take complete control of the country, stronger than ever before. So this leads to the question, who are the Taliban? As the current ruling group, it's very important to know about them. The Taliban, meaning students in Pashto, emerged during the Afghan Civil War in the 1990s. The movement was founded in 1994 by Mullah Muhammad Omar, who gathered a group of religious students or Talibs and former rebel fighters in and around Kandahar city in the country's south. They adhere to a strict interpretation of Sharia or Islamic law and believe that all aspects of life, including governance, law, and social conduct, should be governed by this interpretation of Sharia. They reject Western influences and see democratic governance as un-Islamic. These Talibs turned their strict interpretation of Islam into a fundamentalist movement and benefited from the anarchy that persisted in Afghanistan outside of the capital city Kabul during the Civil War. With Afghanistan torn apart by warlords, corruption, and violence, many in the country saw the Taliban rule as a good thing. They put it as a strict law and order solution to the chaos of war. Today, again at the helm of affairs in Afghanistan, the Taliban appear to be no different than what they were in the 1990s. The Taliban uphold traditional gender roles, enforcing strict codes of behavior for women, including dress codes, restrictions on movement, and limitations on education and unemployment. They believe women should primarily focus on domestic roles. In addition, they enforced conservative social norms, including bans on music, television, and other forms of entertainment they considered immoral. Public punishments, such as floggings and executions, are used to enforce their moral code. So, once in power, the Taliban imposed a harsh version of Islamic law, creating one of the worst human rights conditions for women globally. They banned all kinds of activities for women, including education and work. Women caught in public with unrelated men were flogged, and married women faced death by stoning. Taliban justice included swift trials, public amputations, and executions. They quickly shut down women's universities and forced almost all women to quit their jobs. Before the Taliban's rise, women made up 70% of school teachers, 50% of government workers and university students, and 40% of doctors in Kabul. But under Taliban rule, they were confined to their homes. So how does the political system operate? Well, spending the US-occupied era as a presidential republic, under the Taliban, the country operates as an Islamic Emirate, a state governed strictly by their interpretation of Islamic principles. The Taliban aim to enforce Sharia law as defined by their Hanafi ulema, viewing other systems as not Islamic enough. Although the government does not conform to the traditional separation of powers with separate executive, legislative, and judicial branches, it's still helpful to conceptualize it in this way. With the Taliban executive, the ultimate authority in the Taliban government is vested in the Supreme Leader. The Supreme Leader holds extensive powers and authority over all aspects of governance, making the role analogous to a combination of executive and supreme judicial authority. The Supreme Leader has the final say on all matters, including religious, political, and military, with his decrees being considered binding. This means that the Afghan government today is a theocracy, where the Supreme Leader and judge are the same, and who makes and interprets the laws according to his interpretation of Islamic teaching in the Quran and Sunnah. The Taliban have established an interim government with a council of ministers headed by a prime minister. The Council of Ministers acts as a sort of cabinet handling the day-to-day of the administration and implementation of policies. However, significant decisions typically require approval from the Supreme Leader. With a few exceptions, the Taliban have maintained the republic's administrative structure, with powerful figures given ministerial postings to manage a certain area of the country, such as foreign affairs and defense. They abolished the Ministry of Women Affairs in favor of the infamous Ministry of Virtue and Prevention of Vice, and the electoral commissions were dissolved. In terms of national staffing, it appears that the Taliban have retained the majority of the staff in technical ministries who stayed in the country, while appointing Taliban members to leadership positions. In contrast, non-Talibs were nearly completely removed from the security ministries. So the Taliban appear to have replaced the majority of the workforce in ministries dealing with sensitive areas such as education and higher education. On the local government level, the Taliban have replaced most of the workforce in the administration with Taliban militants in order to solidify their grip over the country and produce employment for the now excessive combat force, although they have kept the majority of teachers and professors. Most hiring decisions at the national and local levels are made based on the proximity to the Taliban rather than competence. Under the 2004 Constitution in the Republic, the state's legislative power was legally delegated to a bicameral legislature known as the National Assembly. However, the Taliban have dissolved this entity. As of now, there is no functioning parliament. Legislative functions are carried out through decrees issued by the Supreme Leader and directives from the Taliban leadership. These decrees are enforced without the need for a formal legislative process. The Ministry of Promoting Virtue and Preventing Vice has possibly issued the most directives. These directives frequently purport not to legislate, but to notify the public that the ministry intends to enforce certain provisions that it considers to be obligatory on Afghans by virtue of being Muslim, or citizens of a Muslim state in the case of non-Muslims. Examples of these orders include male government officials being required to wear beards and head coverings, as well as women being required to cover their faces and be escorted by a male relative when traveling more than a set distance. The judicial system under the Taliban is based on their interpretation of Islamic law, primarily following the Hanafi school of jurisprudence. These courts handle all legal matters, including criminal, civil, and family law. The Taliban Emir has appointed only those with the titles of Shaykh, Mufti, and Mullavi. These are titles of clerics who are appointed based on their religious credentials and knowledge of Islamic jurisprudence Rather than formal legal education, the supreme leader has significant influence over judicial appointments. These elections have eliminated people with modern legal education and training in Afghan state legislation from the Afghan court. The judicial system primarily enforces decrees issued by the supreme leader and the Taliban leadership, judicial decisions being expected to align with the ideological and political goals of the Taliban. The legal criminal court system only handles a limited percentage of cases, leaving it up to Taliban fighters and local commanders to punish those convicted of crimes. Taliban fighters have typically punished people accused of a crime on the scene or after a brief on-site investigation. The punishment has varied from public humiliation to corporal punishment and even death. So what is the Taliban plan for Afghanistan? The Taliban declared victory in their 20-year struggle with Western-backed forces, stating that they plan to establish an open, inclusive Islamic government in Afghanistan. Taliban spokesman Mohammad Naeem emphasized their desire for a peaceful transfer of power and stated they do not intend to govern alone. Suhail Shaheen, another spokesman, assured that there would be no retribution against those who collaborated with foreign forces and the Ghani government. However, many Afghans fear a return to the extreme rule. The Taliban aim to re-establish Sharia law and have already taken steps of a gradual regression. They declined to guarantee safe evacuation for Afghans before the Taliban fully assumed control, stating, "Our policy is that no one should leave the country. We need every Afghan to stay." International authorities worry that the Taliban might abandon their commitments to the West made during peace talks. Earlier this year, the Taliban expressed a desire for a genuine Islamic system that would protect women's and minority rights according to cultural traditions and religious rules. Despite this, Taliban fighters occasionally visit workplaces and order women to leave, signaling a potential rollback of rights gained by Afghan women over the past 20 years. As a result, the Afghan Taliban government has not yet been recognized by the international community. The international community has tied recognition to human rights, especially the rights of women and girls. The United Nations and major powers are pushing for an inclusive and representative government. So the future of Afghanistan governance remains unclear, but the hope for an inclusive or at least plural government persists. With continued effort from the international community, a more representative form of governance could be achieved, since the Taliban, like all other rulers, need the international community's support to run the country's economy. In conclusion, Afghanistan has endured much hardship, with its people suffering throughout history. While many outsiders may disagree with the Taliban's view of the world, they are the only group over the past 50 years that has actually shown any ability to bring stability to the country. While human rights concerns remain, the Afghan people actually finally have a chance of something they haven't had in a long time: peace. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Is there any solution for the Taliban government? But until next time.